If we want housing at more affordable prices and to expand homeownership, we need policies that remove barriers and empower the private sector. With the Trump administration, a Republican-led Congress, and state-level leadership committed to reform, we can restore affordability and give Americans the chance to own a home. Hello, welcome to this week's Economy. I'm your host, Dr. Vance Ginn. Thank you for joining me again today. Well, we got a lot to talk about, but really this is focused on homeownership, the construction industry, and what policies are going on that might influence this, because I've heard a lot from American families about homeownership. And look, I mean, at the end of the day, this is a cornerstone of the American dream. I don't think there is one American dream. There are many, but one of those usually includes homeownership. Now, it's not for everyone, but many people are looking to get a house, right? Whether it be a home, renting, property, that sort of thing. And I've talked about property tax in the past, but I also want to consider some other factors that are going on that are influencing this market as housing prices continue to rise in many places across the country. And even renting has become more expensive, leaving families squeezed on all sides. But look, there are signs of hope. Several states are taking action this legislative cycle, exploring ways to reduce or eliminate property taxes. Yes, let's do that. But more can and should be done at both the state and federal levels to make homeownership more affordable. Smart policy reforms won't just benefit buyers, they'll help lower rental costs too, easing the pressure on families across the board. That's exactly what we're going to dive in today in this week's Economy, okay? So let's get right to it. Now, let's talk a little bit about what got us here. All right. So like kind of the background. So under the Trump administration, we had pro-growth policies like the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, deregulation, private sector driven development. All these things help boost the economy and expand housing opportunities. These reforms reduce barriers and encourage new construction. But the pandemic and the Biden administration's response reversed that progress. Lockdowns and supply chain disruptions stalled projects, while massive spending and regulatory expansion drove inflation, raising the cost of materials and pushing high housing prices even higher. And of course, we're going to talk about the lockdown and everything else that did to supply and demand as well. We had a lot of shocks, is what we call in economics. We had a lot of shocks going on in the housing market and construction and everything else. This really took a hit. Now what we've seen is that higher interest rates, labor shortages, and elevated material costs are making homes less affordable for working families. But the solution isn't more government spending or regulation. It was a lot of this is because of government failures. We shouldn't double down on government failures. What we really need to do is return to policies that let builders build. Imagine that. Lower taxes, faster permitting, zoning reform, and access to skilled labor are essential to increasing housing supply and reducing cost. Right? This is an affordability issue that should be led with abundance. And even some Democrats and the progressives are talking about abundance now. Now, some of that has to do with more government involvement, whereas I would like to see government pulled out of the way. But we should be thinking about abundant housing, abundant energy, abundant AI, a number of different things. But in the construction and housing industry in particular, I think if we can remove some of these barriers to entry, the barriers to the higher costs and everything else from keeping people to supply more in the marketplace for housing, we would be in a much better situation. So the future, if we want housing at more affordable prices and to expand homeownership, we need policies that remove barriers and empower the private sector. With the Trump administration, a Republican-led Congress, and state-level leadership committed to reform, we can restore affordability and give Americans the chance to own a home. All right, so I'm going to have more studies in here as well of looking at different policy solutions, but that's kind of the background of where we've been. So number one that I think we really need to do is to reduce government spending and pass sustainable budgets at every level of government. With the national debt now surpassing $36 trillion, runaway government spending has become a crisis. Many states are following suit, pushing budgets to unsustainable levels and putting long-term fiscal health at risk. Fiscal restraint is essential to preserving competitiveness and economic stability. What I've provided as recommendations here is first to rein in federal spending. We can't have deficits balloon to $2 trillion annually, pushing the national debt to 125% of GDP. Reckless bipartisan, and this has been bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats have continued to overspend, fueling inflation as the Fed prints that debt, and created uncertainty for families and businesses. We must cut spending and pursue pro-growth policies to restore balance. We also should have strict spending limits that ties government spending growth to a maximum rate of population growth plus inflation as used in Colorado's Taxpayer Bill of Rights. We should ensure that everyone can actually, pay for government. And that's what population growth plus inflation does. It's a good measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending. Part of this should also be including eliminating government waste, fraud, and abuse. The Department of Government Efficiency focuses on cutting this. Now they're looking at a lot of things. They haven't done a whole lot, but they've done some things already. And we've also seen this start to happen across the country as well. I would also like to see private sector audits of government come in. Think about how do we sustain this? How do we control the budget? How can we use zero-based budgeting and priority-based budgeting to make sure that every taxpayer dollar is being used somewhat wisely? I would always consider it to be wiser to leave it in the productive private sector. But if we're going to have some roles for government, let's make sure it's done wisely. And remember, and I'm going to put this in the show notes page, you can check out my other research at Americans for Tax Reform or the Club for Growth Foundation, where I wrote guides on how to stick to sustainable budgets. Number 2, deregulate the economy. Excessive regulation and outdated zoning laws are key drivers of the housing affordability crisis. Restrictive zoning limits, where and what types of homes can be built, constrain supply and increasing in prices overall. Reforming these policies would increase housing availability, boost competition, and reduce costs for businesses and renters. Beyond zoning, burdensome regulations, especially in construction, raise building costs and slow development. My solutions here are that we need to look at the regulatory costs. Under the Biden administration, we had final regulatory costs of $1.8 trillion in addition to all the other regulations that are out there. This is a stealth tax that raises prices, stifles innovation, delays growth. A Trump administration right now must prioritize cutting red tape, especially in industries like housing and infrastructure. We also need faster permitting that accelerates construction timelines, reduces material delays, and supports nationwide growth in housing and development, especially right now with a lot of uncertainty with tariffs and trade and where you're going to get your resources from. Allowing for faster permitting would help to speed up that process so that you can plan for the future. You can budget more wisely and allow for that to happen. And also, we need to look at loosening restrictions that are going to allow for supply to meet demand. That comes from government paring itself back, or state and local governments in particular, and maybe even preemption laws by the state. Because remember, the local governments are wards of the state, but preemption laws by the state so that local governments can't be overly burdensome in areas that tend to have more progressive leadership. Kind of like in Texas where I live, it's this blueberries in a sea of red, but those blueberries are really harmful and shift out a lot of those costs to nearby red areas, such as Houston, out into the Woodlands or other places, or in Austin, out to Round Rock in different places. There is a spillover effect. So I've talked about this as well, and the war on institutional investors, why politicians are attacking the wrong housing problem. And I think that's something else we need to look at. So be sure to check out the show notes page for that. Number 3, cut taxes and encourage growth. Right now, what's going on is property taxes are fundamentally unfair. They're a bad tax. I think they're an 18th century tax. We need to move it to the modern 21st century. They essentially make us, homeowners, they make us rent from the government forever. True home ownership should mean owning your home without a lifelong tax burden. In particular, once you pay off your mortgage, you shouldn't really own anything else. Now, if you want to pay sales taxes and other thing, that's one thing. But I think this is an area where we need less government spending at the state and local levels, and use any surpluses to reduce property taxes in states that don't have any other types of taxes, especially income taxes. But even if you have an income tax, maybe that's not as burdensome. Places like Montana, they're looking at eliminating their own property tax because the income tax remains pretty low. But ultimately, you want to get rid of this disincentive to be more productive, to work. That should be out of the way as quickly as possible for hardworking families to keep more of what they earn, especially when trying to find better housing. I think another big part of this is going to be extending the Trump tax cuts. This is leading to a lot of other uncertainty in the economy, as those are set to expire at the end of 2025 for the lower individual rates and a higher standard deduction and a number of other provisions that are part of that 2017 law. And so the Trump administration should prioritize extending and strengthening these reforms to keep relief in place for American families. I think we should also lower the corporate tax rate. We're still at 21% at the federal level, about 4% at the state and local level. We're at 25% as the average rate across the United States. That's even higher than the developed world's average and China's. So to make us a global leader in innovation and be more competitive, I think we should get it down to at least 15% with a long-term goal of eliminating it. Because remember, businesses don't pay taxes, people do. And this will allow for more economic growth and prosperity. I've got a great piece on this on X. How extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act offers a rare moment of relief for American families. So check that out. Number 4, infrastructure needs. There's robust trade, energy, and infrastructure sectors are essential to a strong construction industry, which in turn helps the housing supply and reduce costs. To support these foundational industries, Policymakers should prioritize pro-growth, free market policies that allow businesses to thrive. One area to do that is a strong economy relies on domestic energy production, and the construction industry plays a vital role in that effort. The Trump administration's focus on rolling back burdensome binary regulations can reduce costs, boost job creation, and enhance national security. What we really need is more free trade, and that will allow for us to get rid of the tariffs on steel and aluminum and other things that raise prices, and it may help some of the steel producers, but it hurts a lot more of those downstream as they don't have as much flexibility in order to raise their prices. And so I think that's also a big part of this. We also should have more public-private partnerships, I think. We should also be privatizing a lot of roads and housing and energy in general instead of having government take it over in Texas and other places. But we should also think about public-private partnerships where those make sense as well. Check out my recent speech at the Texas Aggregates and Concrete Association on how policy uncertainty drives economic volatility in election year. I'm also going across the country speaking at different trade groups, especially dealing housing and construction and aggregates and things like that, and concrete as well. Those are some of the things I'm doing as well because I think it's so important about our foundational part of our economy. And then number 5, workforce development. The construction industry faces severe labor shortages, driving wages and delaying projects. We need a stronger, more reliable workforce to meet demand and keep costs reasonable. Part of this is going to include workforce development. So states should adopt Utah's successful one-door approach, which integrates workforce training and social services to help individuals, especially those in poverty, enter and stay in the workforce. Expand technical education, boosting access to technical schools and apprenticeships where equip workers with the skills the industries need without overburdening taxpayers or pushing everyone toward a traditional college path. Grow the labor force. Smart immigration reforms, which we need, can help fill critical labor gaps, especially in difficult to staff roles. These reforms will support industries like construction while ensuring the economy continues to grow and housing doesn't continue to rise at a rapid rate. I discussed smart immigration policies to help grow the workforce in a recent episode that I have on the Let People Prosper show, so be sure to check that out as well. I've also got a nice construction guide that's looking at the housing industry and other things that you should go to my website at vanceginn.com and check out, but I'll also put that into the show notes page as well. So with all that fun stuff, thanks for joining me in this episode of This Week's Economy. For more insights, visit vanceginn.com and even get greater value with a paid subscription or complimentary subscription to my Substack newsletter at vanceginn.substack.com. God bless you. And until next time, let people prosper.